මේ පින්වන්ත රාත්‍රියේ ඓතිහාසික සෙන්කඩගල නුවර සිට ඔබ සැමට උතුම් දළදා සමිඳුන්ගේ ආශිර්වාදය ප්‍රාර්ථනා කරමින් අප සූදානම් වෙන්නේ ඓතිහාසික කන්ද උඩරට ඇසල පෙරහැර මහා මංගල්‍යයේ තුන්වන රන්දෝලි පෙරහරේ සිරි විසිතුර ඔබට සජීවීව ගෙන එන්නට. මල්වතු අස්කිරි උභය මහා විහාරීය මහානායක මාහිපාණන් වහන්සේලාගේ අවවාද අනුශාසනා පෙරදැරිව ශ්‍රී දළදා මාලිගාවේ ගරු දේවර්ණ නිලමේතුමන් සිව් මහා දේවාලයන්හි බස්නායක නිලමේතුමන්ලාගේ සංවිධාන ශක්තියෙන් මෙවර පෙරහැර සංවිධානය වෙනවා. මේ පෙරහැරේ සිරි විසිතුර දැක බලා ගැනීමට සියසින් දැක බලා ගැනීමට මහජනතාවට මෙවර ඉඩ ප්‍රස්තාව හිමි නොවන නිසාවෙන් අප සජීවීව රූපවාහිනි මාධ්‍ය ඔස්සේ මේ පෙරහැරේ විසිතුර ඔබට ගෙන එනවා. අපි දැන් සූදානම් වෙන්නේ ඓතිහාසික කන්ද උඩරට ඇසල පෙරහැර මහා මංගල්‍යයේ තුන්වන රන්දෝලි පෙරහැරේ අසිරිය ඔබට ගෙන එන්නට.
Dalanda Samidu Pihitai. You are now joining us with a special live broadcast of the third Randoli Perahera, brought to you by the Media Bureau of Sri Dalanda Maligava.
You are now seeing Perahera officials obtaining the permission and blessings of the Diyavadana Nilame before commencing their street perambulations.
Making his way from the upper to the lower chamber, the Diyavadana Nilame ceremoniously and reverentially takes the relic's casket under the protection of the chief incumbent of the Malwatta Mahaviharaya, Venerable Tibbatuave Medankara Thero, to the royal tusker.
The relic casket is now placed within the Ranhilige that is mounted on the adorned tusker, who will light up the third Randoli Perahera.
Marking the beginning of the Kandy Esala Perahera, dedicated to Lord Buddha, we see the Perahera officials offering flowers and garlands to the Perahera casket.
And this is the devout moment when the great tusker steps majestically down from the Mahavahalkada, or the main entrance, to the Sandagala, or the moonstone, in preparation to walk in the streets of Kandy. And the royal tusker in today's third Randoli Perahera is the great tusker Vasana, belonging to the historic Ruhunu Maha Kataragama Devalaya. Indeed a tusker who has qualified in all aspects to become the royal tusker in the Kandy Esala Perahera.
And thus, we mark the beginning of the third Randoli Procession in the hill capital city, Kandy. Now we see a bird's-eye view of the serenely beautiful Kandy city and the temple of the Tooth Relic. To broaden our knowledge about the Kandy Esala Procession and the dances that we witness in this great cultural fiesta, today we have a very prominent individual joining with us. And this is Mr. Ravi Bandhu Vidyapati, Kala Kirti, and the veteran dancer.
While welcoming Mr. Ravi Bandhu Vidyapati into our live broadcast, we are now seeing the very first item in today's third Randoli Perahera, which are the whip wielders who are walking up front with the sound of the whips piercing through the skies.
When the rain god pours down life-giving water from the heavenly sky, there we hear the roaring sound of the thundering. This is the very sound symbolized by these lashing whips. They fill the Kandian sky and the hearts of the weavers alike. This is why the whip wielders are tasked with paving the way for the approaching Perahera and the sacred relic casket. And this troupe of West dancers, this troupe of whip wielders have been trained by Mr. Upali Jayaratna.
On the previous years, we have seen great numbers of people who throw coins into the paths of the whip masters as an offering to ward off evil from their children and smoothen their life path.
Indeed, Nilesh. But due to the corona pandemic situation that prevails in Sri Lanka right now, we don't see any such crowd. Yet, we believe that these spectators are watching the Kandy Esala Procession from the convenience and comfort of their homes with the same respect and reverence.
Precisely. And that is the Media Bureau of Sri Dalada Maligava, who will be bringing this third Randoli Perahera all the way to your device to watch this great pageant from wherever you are.
The whip wielder's duty is handed down from generation to generation of their clans. According to our traditions, Peraheras that do not have this pedigree are not even worth being called such.
Although the whip conjures up fear in most minds, the sight of these Perahera whip masters has a calming effect to alert the people that the Perahera is on its way.
And following the whip wielders, we now see a group of fireball dancers. And this is the fireball dancers troupe trained by Mr. E.D. Tilakaratna.
Just as the lightning flashes across the skies, the Perahera too has its flashes of light, whipping across the faces of the people, lining in the streets to watch the procession. And this is the offering of fire to the gods to water the earth with rain.
Indeed, Nilesh. The balls of fire is indeed a spectacular sight in the Kandy Esala Perahera. The fireball wielders create cyclic patterns in the dark sky, reminding the lay spectators of the lightning that marks a soon-to-be rain. While it may seem like a sport for the young performers, the elderly see it rather as a sacred duty to please the gods.
Another belief behind the tradition of the Kandy Esala Perahera is that it signifies a painting of a rainfall. And these fire dancers we see in front of us are the actors of the great power of lightning. I think Mr. Ravibandhu Vidyapati would be able to add a little bit on how the Perahera festival is actually a painting of a rainfall.
Well, the Perahera symbolizes, it is believed that the Perahera brings forth prosperity to the nation, to the island. Hence, symbolically representing the thunder, the lightning, etc. And here we see the fire wheel performers symbolically presenting the form of the sun with their fire wheels.
Indeed, sir. And for a spectator watching the Perahera from afar, these fireballs may remind a dozen of pandals illuminating the streets.
As the performers make different formations vertically and horizontally.
These fire dancers are indeed completely focused and immersed in their art, keeping their minds and bodies one-pointed as they create their cyclic patterns of fire, just as Mr. Ravibandhu Vidyapati stated. And this is because the slightest inattention could lead to a complete disaster, isn't it, sir?
You're right, indeed. One needs long years of rigorous training to achieve such high levels of performance in an art like this, which combines dance and acrobatics.
The sun, moon, earth, universe, solar month, night and day are all cyclic, and the fire dancers highlight these universal cycles and how they warm and cool us in our cycles of life. It should also be noted that these dancers tame fire and give it as a Dalada offering, mindful of its part in cooking, protecting crops and their paddy fields, and in dispelling darkness while creating curiosity in the minds of the spectators.
We now reach the next item, who are the flag bearers, led by a national flag.
Indeed, the national flag of Sri Lanka is a symbol of unity and harmony. It represents all the ethnicities that we are, and it proudly represents our cultural identity, which runs for over 2,500 years. The Buddhist flag bearers display our Buddhist inheritance that has nurtured our culture into what it is today.
The sight of the Buddhist flag indeed creates a sense of unreflecting joy on the part of the people viewing the Kandy Esala Procession, reminding them that this is celebration, devotion and offering to the Buddha. The flag bearers we see representing the students from the Chandananda Buddhist College in Askiria can be seen coming into the site in this third Randoli Procession.
The six-colored flag is a display of ceremonious form to remind the people simply of the great scope and depth of the Buddha's Dharma. The hexacolored flag garlands the people with six-colored radiation of light attributed to the Buddha, cooling them as nothing else possibly can.
Followed by the Buddhist flag bearers, now we see the ancient provincial flag bearers.
The provincial flags or the Disa flags that we witness now demonstrate the powerful authority the Sri Lankan kings had over their territory. And this troop of flag bearers have also been trained by the Chandananda Buddhist College.
This troop of flag bearers were led by the sun and moon standard of the Satara Korale. Next, the lion flag of the Sat Korale. Then in line, the white flag of Matale, the Sabaragamuwa silk flag, a flag with the Berunda Pakshiya of the Thun Korale, the peacock standard of Uwa Walapane, and lotus stands of the Udapalata.
Through these flags, the people were able to identify if the governance of the Kandian kings was well and in accordance with the Raja Dharma. In those times, the display of these flags was also a political symbol. Therefore, those officials of the areas who recognized the sovereignty of the Kandian king brought their flags and standards.
Now what we see are the metal stand bearers. These stand bearers represent those who make gold ornaments for the pageant and gold and silver ornaments for the king.
The kings believed that the durability of these metal standards would symbolize the strength and sustainability of the kingdom itself. It reflects the artistry levels with detailed engravings.
And these brass standard bearers are represented by Mr. Ajit Mahendra. And now, in order to symbolize protection for the Kandy Esala Perahera, we see the sword bearers who were once again represented by the Chandananda Buddhist College in Askivi.
One may wonder the function of sword bearers in a Buddhist procession such as this. While Buddhism promotes non-violence, it is with utmost respect and gratefulness that we remind our heroes who sacrificed so much to ensure the protection of the sacred tooth relic and the sovereignty of the country. The sword bearers remind us of these glorious souls.
protective army, we see the very first Tusker in today's third Randoli Procession, who is joining the Perahera with the Peramune Rala. And this Tusker is Nadungamuye Raja, belonging to Dr. Harsha Dharmavijaya of Valiveria.
Our noble ancestors donated many of their properties to the Temple of the Tooth Relic. The secretarial scroll on the hands of the Peramune Rala represents those ancient legal documents, the duties of the officials, the traditions, rituals and services due to the great and sacred Esala Procession. And following that, we see the first heresy troop representing Sri Dalanda Maligava.
And Mr. Ravi Bandhu Vidyapati would be the best to explain to our audience on the resemblance of the hay visit troop.
Yes, the first ensemble of the drummers representing the traditional orchestra of Sinhala music known as Panchaturya Nadaya, the fivefold musical instruments, the fivefold musical sounds. Now, four of these five types are represented here: Daula, the large cylindrical drum; Tammatama, the two-faced kettle drum; Thalampata, the hand cymbals that keep the beat; and Horanava, the traditional Sri Lankan horn, are played, giving a symphonic sound. Drummers from the four main lineages, Ihalavela, Molagoda, Uduvala and Malagamana, whose ancestors were assigned by the king to perform the duties to the sacred tooth relic, are leading this band of drummers.
Indeed, sir. And the drums are being incorporated to make the unique sounds. We hear the beats of drums and the tunes of Horanava soaring up to the skies above of the Senkadagala kingdom.
Followed by the official hay visit troop of the Sri Dalada Maligava, we see the Gajanayaka Nilame, or the royal chieftain of the king's troop of Tuskers. And the Gajanayaka Nilame is on the mount of the great Tusker Kotte Raja, belonging to Venerable Alutnuwara Anuruddha Thero, the chief incumbent of the Kotte Raja Mahavihara.
And following that, we see the beetle dancers making their ways in the hill capital city of Kandy to light up the third Randoli Perahera.
The dance known as Bulat Padaya, with a handful of beetle leaves which symbolizes welcoming or an offering. This dance carrying beetle leaves is quite a recent addition to the Dalada Perahera, adapted from the ancient ritual Kuhumba Kankarya.
Indeed, sir. The symbolic dance is not only an invitation to the crowds lining the street, but it is also a call to the thousands who hear the sound of the procession. It it is a welcoming gesture to the sacred tooth relic to proceed in the ceremonious elegance along the streets of the Kandy city. And these beetle dancers have been trained by Mr. Nalin Jayasekara.
Has to be mentioned that Mr. Nalin Jayasekara is representing the official dance troupe of Sri Dalada Maligav, who we see performing in front of us this evening. Now to symbolize that this is truly a Buddhist festival, we see an official carrying a Buddhist flag on the mount of a great elephant. And this elephant is named Banda, who belongs to the Honorable Diyawadana Nilame Pradeep Nilangadala. And next we see the coconut flower dance.
Mal Padaya. The coconut flower is considered as a symbol of prosperity in our culture. Also, the use of tender coconut leaves to decorate the ritual arena is yet another common practice in Sinhala dance culture. Here we see the dance Mal Padaya in performance as adapted from the ritual of Kuma Kankarya.
The coconut flower in this dance represents the Kalpa Vruksha, or the heavenly tree, which grants what one desires to have. This connects us once again to the notion of bountifulness. And this dancing troupe has been trained by Mr. W. M. Dayananda.
Followed by the symbols of prosperity, we now see a symbol of majesty, a tusker. And this tusker is in fact the leader of the Sri Dalada Maligava stables, who is none other than Indiraja, the tusker who was gifted to Sri Lanka by the former Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, in the year 1989.
And on his mount, we see an official wearing a canopy representing the protection provided to the sacred tooth relic. And following that, we see a troupe of Chamara dancers trained by Mr. Nimesh Sumanaratna from the Chandananda Buddhist College.
Chamara, the dance with large white tassels, is a popular folk dance that symbolizes fanning. This was a regular performance at the royal courts in the past, and here it's symbolically providing comforts to the sacred tooth relic.
ancient times. The king, his queen, and a selected group of officials were honored by being fanned. Since the living Buddha walks along the streets of the city in this procession, it is with great devotion that the dancers stylize their fanning in ordered columns.
The dance is accompanied by the drum rhythms, a combination of the Kandian drum, the Gataberea, and Daula and Tammatama, accompanied by the melodic sounds of the flute.
And it is indeed a very pleasing sight to see that very young performers, especially school students, taking part in this procession. And this is a good sign to say that these traditional customs will be preserved for the generations to come.
And the students of the Chandananda Buddhist College in Kandy must be credited for this, since we heard their name thrice thus far in today's third Randoli Procession, isn't it, Isuru?
Indeed, Nilesh.
Walking amidst this cooling breeze, we see two of the most senior elephants taking part in today's Dalada Perahera. And these two elephants are Punchi Banda, belonging to Mr. Kitsirimewan Velagedara of Polgahavela, and Raja, belonging to Mrs. Sita Senanayaka Mallava of Hettimulla. And on their mounts, we see officials carrying Burmese flags.
That's true. It should be noted that Burma is nowadays known as Myanmar, is a country which is also having Theravada Buddhist traditions. So these two countries have a very close relationship that we can see that have been symbolized in the Kandy Esala Procession as well. Following that, we see the first Nayandi dance performance team.
Well, Nayandi is the name of this particular costume, which consists of the lower part of the vest costume, yet omits the elaborate headgear, the crowning piece of the entire outfit, which is replaced here with a simple white turban. we just saw the dancers, instead of the linear formations which is usual for Perahera, making a circular formation as in the traditional Komba Kankari ritual.
And this troupe of Nayandi dancers are trained by Mr. Saman Nilvitha.
Finishing with a short kastirama or an ending phrase in the dance was a step known as Teimatra.
And now we see one of the young tuskers in today's Perahera. Indeed, a single-tusked elephant who is Sindhu, belonging to the most venerable Mahanayaka Thero of the Malwatu Mahavihara, Venerable Tibbatuave Sri Siddhartha Sumangala Thero, and the name of this tusker is Sindhu.
On the Mount of Sindhu, we can see a cobra head canopy, once again symbolizing the protection provided to the Perahera as well as to the sacred tooth relic. And following that, we see a tambourine dancing troupe which is trained by Mr. Aryapala Vijayamana.
The troupe of Raban Karakavannan, Raban Karakabima, although commonly called Raban dance, this is in fact a sport, Raban Kridav, as it is referred to in the traditional literature. And it involves the skills of spinning and balancing the tambourine on the fingers and on the tips of a long flexible stick. And in our tradition, we have different types of Rabanas, Atrabanas, Virudurabanas, and here this variation is called the Karakavana Rabana.
The clans of the handheld tambourines are exclusively Kandian. The skill of playing, spinning, and using the tambourine as an instrument to accompany the invoking of the qualities of the Buddha are handed down from father to son and from generation to generation.
Our audience would definitely agree that this is a spectacular form of art, and the performers we see in front of us is trained by Mr. Aryapala Vijayamana.
The spinning Rabana also reminds the people of the impermanence, as when the Rabana breaks free from the rod or stick on which it is spinning.
Followed by these talented artists, we see the tallest elephant participant in today's Randoli Perahera, and he is Gajaba, who belongs to Mr. Ranjit Vijay Singha, of the Moranvatta Devalaya in Yakkala.
And once again, on its mount, we see an official bearing a canopy, once again representing the protection provided to the Perahera. Following that, we see a Pantheru dancing troupe, which is trained by Mr. Palitha Hapugoda.
Panterua is a circular brass frame instrument with small cymbals fixed onto it to give subtle metallic trill as it shakes.
The Pantheru also has a connection to Goddess Pattini, isn't it, sir?
You are exactly right. Panterua is considered to have been originated from the Pattini Salamba or the sacred bells of Goddess Pattini. Considered as one of the semi-classical dance forms pertaining to the Kandian tradition. Like in the classical Kandian forms, there are the traditional families who have brought forth this great tradition of the Pantheru dancing, such as Urapala, Alapalawa, Kadigamuwa, Patha Hewahata and Veraki.
And following this Pantheru dance performance, we see Kandula Veera belonging to Venerable Kanangama Narada Thero, the chief incumbent of the Kaduwela Sankapitti Vihara. Kandula is in fact one of the retired mascots of the Sri Lanka army, who was Kandula IV, and today he is one of the most gentle elephants taking part in the Kandy Esala Perahera.
And following Kandula, we see another very energetic dancing troupe. And this is a mixed folk dance.
This is a somewhat modern concept to mix different types of traditional folk dances in one group. The types combined here are Likeli, the stick dance, Talam, the cymbals, Savaran, the tussles, and Chamara.
And this troupe of mixed folk dancers have been trained by Mr. PCB Vijay Surya.
With their energetic movements, the dancers make interesting formations, crisscross formations, circles, etc., giving the spectators an experience of excitement.
Followed by the mixed folk dance, we see two more officials joining the procession with Burmese flags. And naming these two elephants, on one side we have Madhu, belonging to Venerable Murundeniye Dhammaratana Thero, the chief incumbent of the historic Muthiyangana Rajamaha Vihara in Badulla. And on the other side we see Kandula Thissa, belonging to the historic Sabaragamu Saman Devalaya in Ratnapura. In fact, speaking about the Muthiyangan Rajamaha Vihara, we must mention that the chief incumbent or the Mahanayaka Thero of the Askiri chapter is a resident monk of the Muthiyangan Rajamaha Vihara, to whom this elephant Madhu belongs to.
And Nilesh, compared with the elephants of the Kumal Perahera, do you agree with me that the garments or the robes of the elephants in the Randoli Procession are more colorful and more vibrant?
Exactly. The Kumbal Perahera is simply to signify simplicity, and as mentioned, the Randoli Procession is a celebration of color, glamour, and grandness, which is why we have noticed many colors in the robes of the elephants which we see in the Randoli Processions.
And the duo of elephants are followed by a group of Udakki players.
Udakki Natuma, a traditional dance using the small hourglass-shaped hand drum. This drum was also initially used to give rhythmic accompaniment to the panegyric songs of the Kavikara Madhua.
This troupe of Udakki dancers have been trained by Mr. M.B. Tennakon. Sir, the Udakki is an instrument that we can find in many dancing traditions in Sri Lanka.
In Sri Lanka as well as in the world, the hourglass-shaped drum is found in many parts of the world, in the East, in Africa, and here in the chamber of versifiers, it is said that they played a silver udakkiya, which is even used today in the Perahera.
And these Udakki performers are trained by Mr. M.B. Tennakon.
Udakki dance is essentially a Buddhist form of dance as they sing the virtues of the Buddha while dancing.
It is truly an amazing sight to see how these performers sing song, dance, tune and play the instrument at the same time.
In the many traditions of dancing in Sri Lanka, this is the only dance that you find the dancing, playing and singing, all three forms performed by the dancer himself.
We see most of these performers wearing masks in order to adhere to the health guidelines. And Mr. Abhibandhu, would you like to explain how difficult it would be to perform with such masks?
Well, with my experience as a dancer, I know how much of breathing, control of breath and the heavy breathing a dancer has to do. accompanists playing one of the 5 main rhythms pertaining to Udakki dance known as Donta Paha.
In front of us, we see 2 of the most valuable tuskers who are owned by the Sri Dalada Maligava. On one side we have Singharaja and on the other we see Burumaraja. Singharaja is a tusker who was gifted to Sri Dalada Maligava in the year 1995 from the Sri Lanka Army, and Burumaraja was gifted to Sri Lanka in the year 2007 from the state of Myanmar.
And now we see one of the most awaited sights in the Kandy Esala Perahera. This is an icon of our identity. This is an icon of our culture. We now see a troupe of West dancers. This troupe of West dancers have been trained by Mr. Ishanta Ihalavela and Mr. Lasantha Vansekara.
I would like to ask Mr. Ravi Bandhu to explain about families of Ihalavela and Vansekara in the West dancing troupe who are performing in front of the Perahera casket.
Well, these families have been entrusted the duty of performing the West dance in honor of the sacred tooth relic by the royalty for many generations. Precisely speaking, from the times of King Kirtisri Rajasinghe.
This shows how our traditions haven't changed since the time of kings, regardless of how many activities changed in our surroundings. Isn't it so?
Indeed, Nilesh. This reminds us that we are witnessing a living culture which we can rarely see in many parts of the world.
West, the grand classical dance of Sri Lanka, the most glamorous costume symbolically representing the regalia of Kings Malaya, the royal brothers who performed the ancient ritual of Hatapas Mangalya 2500 years ago. The drummers playing the serene rhythm pattern of the Gajaga Vannama. It is customary that the dancers do not usually go into fast or vigorous movements as a mark of respect to the sacred tooth relic.
So talking about the origin of the West costume, we can take it back to the ritual of Kohomba Kankarya.
You are exactly right. This is the costume or the regalia of Kings Malaya who performed the first Kohomba Kankarya, as I mentioned before, then known as Hatapas Mangalya.
It has been noted that King Kohomba is actually a god who was endemic to the city of Kandy, isn't it, Mr. Ravi Bandhu?
Well, to the whole of hill country, And in our literature, it is mentioned that the king's Malaya entrusted the taking forth of the ritual to a young prince in Sri Lanka, deified him and handed over their regalia to continue with the ritual.
Those would be some well appreciated facts for our audience.
It should be noted that the West dancing costume consists of mainly 64 pieces traditionally.
From head to toe, the regalia of a Sinhala king consisted of 64 ornaments, and the outfit of the West dancers symbolically represents the 64 parts of the ancient monarchs of Sri Lanka.
These West dancers are paying homage to the impending approach of the Perahera casket.
In fact, the role of this particular troupe of West dancers are to escort the royal tusker who will be carrying the Perahera casket. And ahead of the tusker, we see the Karya Choral. I think Isuru, you would be able to explain to the audience on the role of this Karya Choral.
Indeed, Nilesh. The Karya Corona Chorale is the second in command of the Diyavarana Nilame, and it is a heritage position given by royal decree.
Amidst the sound of Nagasingham, we now see the Perahera casket. I think Mr. Ravi Bandhu Vidyapati would be explained to the audience on the resemblance of this Nagasingham troupe.
Yes, Nagasingham or Nagasinnam, the ensemble consists of the Taval, the Patahaberea, and the Nadaswaram, the Dravidian horn associated with it. Nagasinnam, in fact, is the Sinhalized form of the term Nadaswaram.
And now we see the sacred Perahera casket being carried by the royal tusker.
And the royal tusker for this evening is Vasana, belonging to the Ruhunu Maha Kataragama Devalaya. And accompanying Vasana, we see Miyan Raja of the Sri Dalada Maligawa stables and Kandula, belonging to Venerable Kollupitiye Mahinda Sangharakkhita Thero, the chief incumbent of the Kalaniya Rajamahaviharaya.
Following the trio of elephants, we now see the chamber of versifiers or the Kavikara Maduwa.
Mr. Ravi Bandhu, it would be great if we can explain to the audience on what these performers actually singing.
In keeping with the ancient traditions, the Chamber of Versifiers was one of the 5 institutes patronized by the king. In the past, they sang panegyries to the king, and today they sing in serene tone the virtues of the Buddha, accompanied by the tone of the silver pantheru and the silver-bodied Udakya.
And now we see the offering of flowers to the sacred relic casket by a very young group of students.
Back we see flowers and an oil lamp, which are one of the two main utensils that Sri Lankan Buddhists used to pay homage to Lord Buddha. And right after those officials, we now see the second troupe of West dancers we are seeing for the evening, whose role is to escort the presence of the Honorable Diyavadana Nilame. Mr. Roy Bandhu, I think we have noticed that the role of the West dancer is to escort or welcome prominent occasions of the evening. What would be the connection between the royalty and the West dancing form in this case?
Well, actually, the West dance originated from the ritual of Kumbha Kankarya, was adapted to the Dalada Perahera only in the year 1917 by the then Diyavadana Nilame P.B. Nugawala Disava. Up until then, it was confined to the Kankarya.
And this West dancing troupe has been trained by Mr. Sanjeeva Verapitiya and Mr. Peter Surasena.
I believe the families of Verapitiya and Surasena are also quite known names to the Perahera festival, isn't it, Mr. Roy Bandhu?
Well, after giving a little excuse for the spectators to enjoy the West dance, escorting the Diyavadana Nilame, I'd like to talk about the Verapitiya and Surasena families. They have been entrusted, they have been in association with the Dalada Perahera for a long period of time. Guru Peter Surasena, who is represented by his sons here, and of course Guru Sanjeeva Verapitiya, performing the profound movements of his own style.
Following that, we now see the West dancers paying their respect to the Diyavadana Nilame. The The West dancing performance is used in most of our traditional occasions.
Well, yes. Nowadays, mostly as to welcome important people.
And now we see the glorious march of the Honorable Dewad Nilame of the Sri Dalada Maligava, Honorable Pradeep Nilangadala. And it must be commented in this occasion that the color on which the Dewad Nilame is wearing should be matched with the color of the costume the royal tusker will be wearing in the Perahera procession.
The Diyavarna Nilame, appointed by the royal decree, is the individual who is tasked with protecting the Dalada with his own life. And following that, we see the leaders of the 10 villages. The Vidanes of the villagers accompany the Diyavarna Nilame as they collectively pay their respect and homage to the Dalada Vahanse.
Marking the end of the Dalada Perahera, now we witness the commencement of the first Devala Perahera, which is the procession of the Sri Mahanatha Devalaya.
And now we see the godly ornaments of God Natha being carried to be mounted on the tusker who will be taking them in the streets of Kandy in the third Randoli Procession today.
Leading the procession of the Sri Mahanatha Devalaya, we see a set of Buddhist flag bearers who are represented here by the Civil Defence Headquarters of Pallekele. Mr. Roy Bandhu, we have all heard that God Natha is also known as Maitri Bodhisattva. And is that the reason why we see Buddhist flags leading the procession of God Natha?
Well, of course, it is the very reason. And God Natha, worshipped as by all Buddhists as Maitri Bodhisattva, the god aspiring the Buddhahood, hence attributed with the color yellow. You can see the leading tusker is dressed in yellow, symbolizing the color of God Natha.
Following the Buddhist flag bearers, we see the leading elephant of the Sri Mahanatha Devalaya, on whose mount we can see an official carrying the flag of God Natha. And this elephant is Rohana, belonging to Mr. Varuna Kannangara of Purana. And following Rohana, we now see the official Hevisi troop of the Sri Mahanatha Devalaya.
This troupe of Hevisi performers have been trained by Mr. S.Y.G. Vijayasena.
The Natha Devala ensemble of drummers advancing in simple steps to the sound of the Gaman Hevisi. Kundata takkata kundata gajjing is the particular rhythm they are playing.
Is it true that the tunes of the four Devala shrines differ from each other, Mr. Roy Bandhu?
Well, the ensemble of drummers always herald the Peraheras, and They take the lead in giving the signals, changing the rhythm patterns at every turn of the Perahera onto a new street.
And I believe there's a difference in the music what we hear as well compared to Dalada Perahera. And now we see the Gajanayaka Nilame of the Sri Mahanatha Devalaya, the chieftain who will symbolize the responsibility for the troop of elephants taking part in the procession of God Natha. And this elephant is Arjuna, belonging to the Vaurukannala Rajamahavihara in Dikwella.
And on his mount we see a silver ankusa, and this elephant is followed by a group of fan dancers. These Savaram performers have been trained by Mr. Dilshan Shalika from Arya Rangayatanaya.
Savarang, a popular folk dance with tussled sticks, making picturesque formations as they make their way through the Perahera path. These young dancers seem to celebrate the glory of the grand pageant in energetic movements.
It is indeed a very delightful sight to see how these young performers are cooling the entire procession by producing a gentle breeze using their fans.
Youthful and eloquently executed dance movements, colorful costumes, and the long white tassels make the dance a spectacle.
And now we see the third elephant taking part in the procession of God Natha, and he is Vijita Raja, belonging to Venerable Millane Sirialankara Thero, the chief incumbent of the historic Dimbulagala Rajamahavihara in Polonnaruwa.
And now we see another Pantheru dancing performance representing the Natha Devala procession.
And this troupe of Pantheru dancers are trained by Mr. Nimesh Nivantana of the Nimesh Rangayatana of Colombo.
Accompanied by the sound of the Gatabere, the Pantheru dance is considered an essentially Buddhist dance form that grew within the surroundings of the rich and fertile Buddhist cultural atmosphere. Hence, all the ceremonies of this dance form consist of songs and chants glorifying the virtues of the Buddha.
Is it the same reason that we see a Pantheru dance performance in all segments of the Kandy Esala Perahera?
It is exactly the very reason. Today, the Dalada Perahera, these dancers recite poems from rituals such as Suvisi Vivarana, Sat Satya, and Pansali Swas to accompany their dance.
According to one belief, the Pantheru instrument is made in the form of Chakrayudaya, the prime weapon of Shakra, the king of gods.
You are exactly right. And in other literal works, it is also mentioned as the weapon pertaining to God Vishnu.
I think we can speak more on that when we see the Panthiru dance performance in the procession of God Vishnu. And right now we see the mother and son as always, Kumari and Bandara, belonging to Mr. Kamal Kitsiri of Kottava.
Another interesting fact about the Natha Devalaya is that it is one of the oldest buildings remaining in the Kandian city. It is believed that it was built in the 14th century.
And followed by Kumari and Bandara, now we see a thumb at thumb dance performance who are trained by Mr. Jagat Kumar Harishchandra of Ridigama. I think Mr. Ravibandhu, we all saw the thumb at thumb as a musical instrument, but how did it evolve as a dance performance in this case?
Well, Thammatama is one of the main percussion instruments of Sri Lanka and plays a prominent role in Buddhist festivals. In our literature are mentioned 9 types of dance forms described as Tala Natum, Rupa Natum, Atata Natum, Vitata Natum. Now here the Thammattama belongs to the category of Vitata Natum.
And now we see Lasanda belonging to Devinura Upulwan Vishnu Devalaya. I think it's interesting to see the connection how an elephant belonging to a Vishnu Devala shrine is joining the procession of God Natha.
And now we see the West dancing troupe representing the Natha Devala procession. They are dancing in front of the godly ornaments of God Natha. This is a troupe which is trained by Mr. Asanka Karuna Ratna.
Just as in the Dalada Perahera, is it true that even in the Devala processions that we see families who have been doing this role for a long period of time?
Well, of course, you're right. There are the family traditions. I would like to comment on this particular movement of the dancers known as Narumatra, holding the 2 flanking draperies on either side of their hip. This is one of the popular aspects of West dancing. Holding the 2 narus or the draperies as wings of a butterfly.
It looks to me that the headgear worn by the West dancers represent the sun in a way.
Well, you're right, Isuru. The headgear represents the sun. known as the Sikhabandhanaya.
And now we see the chief incumbent of the Sri Mahanatha Devalaya walking in front of the ceremonial tusker who will be carrying the godly ornaments of God Natha. And the ceremonial tusker of the third Randoli Procession for the Natha Devalaya is none other than Muthuraja himself, who belongs to Venerable Okkavita Vipulasara Thero, the chief incumbent of the Aludgama Kandy Vihara, and he is accompanied by Kumari, also belonging to the Kandy Vihara, and Rani, belonging to Mr. Nalaka Jayasingha of Godagama.
Up next, we see the West dancing troupe trained by Mr. Vishuddhi Verapitiya in Amunugama.
The Amunugama tradition or the Amunugama Sampradaya of Kandian dance is also well known for its specific style. We hear of great drummers from the Amunugama family such as Amunugama Suramba Rajapaksa. That was yet another beautiful exposition of the Narumatra, followed by the climaxing Kastirama and Teimatra.
And now we see the Basnayaka Nilames representing the Sri Mahanatha Devala Perahera. We see the Basnayaka Nilame Anura Iriyagama of the Vegiriya Natha Devalaya and Akalanka Bandara Verapitiya of the Dodangwala Natha Devalaya.
And that marks the end of the Natha Devala procession and the commencement of the Vishnu Mahadevala procession. We now see the godly ornaments of God Vishnu being carried by the officials to be placed on the mount of the elephant, who will be taking them in the streets of Kandy in the third Randoli procession today.
Just as the yellow lit streets would turn into blue, we now see the very first item of the Sri Mahavishnu Devala Perahera, and we see the provincial flag bearers represented by the Civil Defence Unit headquarters in Pallekele.
Indeed, Nilesh. And the emblem of the sun and the moon that we can see represent the power of God Vishnu in maintaining and sustaining the order and the balance of the world.
Mr. Ravibandu, would you be able to comment on the flags that we see in front of us? We see them of different colors and different emblems, different symbols. If you can add some value.
Well, the dominant color here seems to be blue, and the traditional colors of our flags and even the costumes were mostly red, white and black. And here, in keeping with the synonymous color of God Vishnu, the color blue has been adapted into some of these flags.
And now we see the first elephant of the Sri Mahavishnu Esala Perahera, on whose mount we can see an official carrying the flag of the Satara Koralaya. And this elephant is Suranimala, who belongs to the Alutnuwara Dadimunda Devalaya. In fact, carrying the flag of the Satara Koralaya is the traditional custom which is to be done on the first elephant that will be going in Sri Mahavishnu Esala Procession. And is there a connection between the flag of the Satara Koralaya and God Vishnu?
Well, God Vishnu is associated with the region of Satara Koralaya, and the Vishnu Devalaya was originally situated in Satara Koralaya before it was brought to Kandy.
And now we see the heavy troop of Sri Mahavishnu Devalaya.
In fact, this is the resident Hevisi troupe of the Sri Mahavishnu Devalaya.
This heavy troop has been trained by Mr. Saman Priyanta Arandegidaram.
The serene and profound rhythm of the Daul and Thammattama is accompanied by the tune of Gajaka Vannama played on the Horanava or the traditional horns.
It should be noted that God Vishnu is not only worshipped by the Buddhists, but he is also one of the chief gods in Hinduism.
Well, Buddhism has accommodated gods and deities, especially from Hinduism. Hence, Vishnu is considered today as a Buddhist god, and he is also known as Upul-One, the god of the blue lotus.
Speaking of Satara Koralaya, I believe Satara Koralaya has a lot to do with the Sabaragamu province of Sri Lanka state.
Well, yes, one border of the Satara Koralaya is Sabaragamu. Hence, you might notice in the dance forms certain links of the Satara Koralaya style of Kandian dance and the Sabaragamu dance forms.
Indeed, which is why we wanted to mention that this particular troupe of Hevisi, in fact, hailing from the Alutnuwara Hevisi tradition in Sabaragamu. Ceremoniously followed by the Hevisi troupe, we now see the Gajanayaka Nilami of the Sri Mahavishnu Devalaya on the mount of Haritha, belonging to Mr. Tusitha Ranavaka of Deniyayan. And it has to be noted that the Gajanayaka Nilami of the Devala shrines are supposed to be ceremoniously clad in white attire, which we see very compliant in the procession of God Vishnu.
And following that, we see another very energetic and very lively dancing troupe. This is a troupe of wooden stick dancers trained by Mr. M.P.R. Bandara from Sasmita Kalayatanaya in Ampara.
Likeli is yet another popular folk dance common to all regions of Sri Lanka, but with the accompaniment of Daula Thammatama and Gata Beraya, this represents the up-country variety of the Likeli dance.
And following these energetic Likeli dancers, we see a majestic elephant.
An elephant representation from the historic Mutyangana Rajamaha Vihara is always seen in the procession of God Vishnu. Unfortunately, Kandula, who was the role of this procession, passed away a month ago. But on his state, Muthu, who also belongs to the Mutyangana Rajamaha Vihara, has taken over his presence in the procession of God Vishnu.
Following that, we see another troupe of Savarang dancers trained by Mr. Ruwan Talgahagoda from the Nityal Gurukula Kala Asapura.
I think, Mr. Vidyapati, we would like to just mention that the Thalgahagoda name in the Kandy Esala Perahera is also quite prominent, if I'm not mistaken.
You're right, the Matale Talgahagoda Paramparava, or the family tradition, better known as exponents of the traditional Bali ceremony, but also great exponents of the West dance and the Kohumba Kankari dances, and have been in association with the Dalada Perahera for long periods of time. The prime purpose of a Savarang dance or the tussle dance is to make formations and spectacles with the tussles. Hence, the dancers confine themselves to very simple movements, but their arms making complex patterns with the tussles.
Can it be assumed that the purpose of this dance performance is to add a cool breeze to the approaching godly ornaments of God Vishnu?
You are exactly right. The meaning of tussle dance or chamara dance, Savarang dance is, the symbolism is fanning.
And that was Abe Raja and Mihin Raja belonging to the Kasagala Rajamaha Vihara.
And now we see another troupe of Udaki players. This Udaki players troupe has been trained by Mr. Saman Siri from Kondadenia. He is representing the Samanranga Kala Ayatanaya.
This troupe of Udaki dancers are also accompanied by the Kandyan drum, although the tradition is for the dancers to play and sing as they dance along.
A adorned in two beautifully clad batik attire. We see Banda belonging to Mr. Sisira Samarakon and of course Galkulama belonging to Mr. Mahinda Millanguda, who is taking part in the Kandy Esala Perahera after a very long period of time.
In most of the robes of these elephants, we see the image of Gurula, a mythical bird which is considered to be the vehicle of God Vishnu.
And next, we see a Pantheru dance performance, who are trained by Mr. K.P. Dharmasiri. I think we left the conversation at one point to speak about the resemblance of the Pantheru and the legend of God Vishnu. I think Mr. Ravi Bandhu will be the best to explain.
Well, the iconography of God Vishnu has in his right hand the Chakrayuda, or the circular weapon that he uses to attack enemies at a distance. So the Pantheru symbolically represents the Chakrayuda of Vishnu.
And now we see Gamunu Kandula and Pillumale of the Pinnavala Elephant Orphanage, who is accompanied by Sanju belonging to Mr. Jagat Vithana. Has to be noted that the Pinnavala Elephant Orphanage has been supplying elephants for the Kandy Esala Perahera for the fourth consecutive time since 2017.
Following that, we witness a troupe of Nayandi dancers. The Nayandi dancers have been taking part in the Kandy Esala procession even before the West dancers. Am I right, sir?
Yes, as the West dance was confined to the Kohomba Kankaria, in the past, before the West dancers came into the Perahera, all the dances were performed in the Nayandi costume. The costume of the Nayandi dancers composite of long draperies, silver and bead ornaments, namely the Ulludaya, the long cloth, Nisan Sangala, the puffy frills on either side, the Devala, and the two long pleats hanging from the two sides. And all these are parts of the traditional West costume, particularly the lower part from the neck downwards.
It is stated that these dancers are hailing from the Vatthigidra Veerasingha generation of the Parampara.
While the West dancing remains to be the most respected and the highest title of the Kandian dancing tradition, the Nayandi dancing is another significant dance in this regard.
And we see a trio of elephants. On one side we have None belonging to Mr. Sarat Jayalat of Kurunagala, Tikiri belonging to Mr. Jagat Vithana of Matugama, and Muthu belonging to Mr. Indika Mudunkot of Manikinna. And now we see the first West dancing troupe of the Sri Mahavishnu Devalaya, who are trained by Mr. Kondadeniye Samansiri of the Saman Ranga Ayatana, who will be escorting the ceremonial tusker, carrying the godly ornaments of God Vishnu.
it is mentioned in the literature connected with the Kumbha Kankarya that there is a god associated, a deity associated from each and every part of the costume of the West dancer from head to toe.
The West dancers have proven themselves worthy of the West Tattva or the West headgear through a number of tests. It takes years of practice and a great effort to obtain that headgear.
And now we see the chief incumbent of the Sri Maha Vishnu Devalaya, who will be walking ahead of the ceremonial tusker. And this is the highlight of the Sri Maha Vishnu Esala Perahera, where as usual the great single-tusked yet majestic tusker Rama, belonging to Mr. Tudor Gunasekara of Heyantoduwa, will be carrying the godly ornaments of God Vishnu. And Rama is interestingly accompanied by Sita, belonging to Mrs. Nilanthi Veerasinghe of Mirigama, and Vasana, belonging to Ms. Krishanti Alapatha of Ratnapura. It's interesting to see how Rama and Sita are together in the Vishnu Esala procession as well, apart from the Ramayana, isn't it, Mr. Royban? And now we see the second group of West dancers who are trained by Mr. Sarath Ekanayaka of the Saraswati Kala Ayatana. We see these West dancers escorting the Basnayaka Nilames of the rural shrines, and today we have the Basnayaka Nilame of the Alawathugoda Saman Devalaya, Honorable Jayampati Heenkenda, and also the Honorable Basnayaka Nilame of the Wallahagoda Katharagama Devalaya, Sivali Nugegoda.
With that, we mark the end of the Sri Maha Vishnu Esala Perahera and the commencement of the Sri Maha Katharagama Esala Perahera. We now see the godly ornaments of God Skanda being carried to be placed on the mount of the elephant, who will be tasked with taking them in the streets of Kandy today.
And leading the procession of God Katharagama, we see an official carrying a Buddhist flag, another official carrying the flag of King Ravana, followed by a mixture of Buddhist flags and a set of cloth flags representing a peacock. I think Isuru, you would be interested in telling about the peacock.
Well, yes. The peacock is considered as the vehicle of God Skanda. According to one of the legends, it is said that God Skanda defeated one of the most powerful demons, and then he turned that demon into a peacock.
Mr. Raviband, we would like to know the resemblance of King Ravana in the procession of God Katharagama.
Well, Ravana was a follower or a devotee of Shiva, according to our legends, the father of God Katharagama. It is interesting to note that the color of the Perahera from the serene deep blue changes to a strong powerful red, as according to the Hindus, God Skanda is considered the god of war, but to us Buddhists, he is the protector of Buddhism and our land.
Watching the Kandy Esala Perahera would indeed be a lot of learning for anyone who would be interested in knowing about the story of Buddhism and how diverse our teachings are. And following the Buddhist flags, we now see the main Hevisi troupe of the Sri Maha Katharagama Devalaya, who are led by Mr. P.V. James Gurunanse.
Drummer hailing from the traditional families of the Panikis, the leaders of the Hevisi players of the Perahera.
Hevisi is an offering of sound that existed in Sri Lanka since the arrival of Sangamitta Theri in 288 BC.
Exactly. Ever since the sacred Bodhi sapling was brought to Lanka by Theri Sangamitta, paying homage to Buddha and the sacred objects associated with the Buddha has been a strong tradition.
Followed by the Hevisi troupe, we see the Gajanayaka Nilame of the Sri Maha Katharagama Devalaya, who is on the mount of Manike, belonging to Mr. Anura Kempitiya of Kegol. An interesting fact here is that the very anchors used by this Gajanayaka Nilame is in fact the anchors used in the time of King Rajadi Rajasingha.
And following that, we see a group of castanet players lighting up the way of the third Randoli Procession.
And this troupe of castanet players are led or trained by Miss Ajanta Kandegedara of the Sarasavi Kala Ayatanaya of Kegol.
Beautifully adorned in beige and red in keeping with the tradition of God Katharagama, the castanet players advancing through. And they are accompanists following them with an energetic rhythm on the Daula and Tammatama.
We see another elephant joining the procession of God Katharagama, and this elephant is Kadira, belonging to the Vipashyarama temple in Maharagama.
And on the mount of Kadira, we see two officials bearing the emblems of the sun and the moon, representing the dominance and the authority of God Skanda. And following that, we see a troupe of wooden stick dancers.
And this troupe of wooden stick dancers are trained by Mr. Upali Dharmaratna of the Upali Dharmaratna Kala Ayatanaya of Matale. Mr. Rai Bandhu, I would like to ask you this question about the importance of Kala Ayatana or aesthetic academies in Sri Lanka in preserving these traditional arts.
Well, the Kalayatanas formed in Sri Lanka in the 1930s, considered as extensions or more institutionalized teaching organizations from the Gurukula tradition, has kept our traditional dance art alive for over 70 to 80 years now. If not for the efforts of the Kalayatana gurus, our traditional dance forms would have died very easily. So the nation must be thankful to them for keeping these great traditions alive.
Indeed. And just as we saw the passing of Ratna from Palmadulla, now we see a troupe of Udakki dance performers who are trained by Dhammika Bandara Tennakon of the Dhammika Bandara Kala Ayatana of Napana.
The Udakkiya is an instrument that represents Damaruva, one of the instruments that we see in God Vishnu images.
God Shiva. The Damaru is associated with God Shiva, and according to tradition and legends, Shiva creates the cosmic sounds from the Damaru.
Just as we see Sama belonging to Venerable Uduwe Dhammaloka Thero, the chief incumbent of the Alan Methiniyarama temple in Kirulapana, we are about to witness a complete change in the tempo, the culture of this procession.
This is a peacock dance representing the Katharagama Devala procession.
And they are trained by Miss Vinitha Jayaratna of Galevela, representing the Sri Ranamayura Kala Ayatana.
Peacock, being the vehicle of God Katharagama, is represented here with the rhythm that stems from the heartbeat, and here the drummers express or physically manifest the rhythm in a faster tempo.
The gleaming costumes of these performers add more color and splendor to this dance.
The drum ensemble consists of side drums, snare drums, cymbals, and of course one special drum, that is the tawal from South India.
Followed by these lovely peacocks. Now we are seeing Chula, belonging to Venerable Bengamuwe Dhammadinna Thero, who is the chief incumbent of the Siripada Viharaya and the Palmadulla Rajamaha Viharaya in Ratnapura. In fact, Chula is a participant of the Kandy Esala Perahera since his childhood, and we saw him carrying the godly ornaments of God Katharagama in the first Kumbal Perahera this year for the first time in his life. And now in front of us we see the Kavadi dance performance, who are led by Mr. Indika Prasad Kularatna.
Indeed, this is one of the most distinguished dance performances of Katharagama Devalaya, resembling the South Indian dancing traditions. And also we see that some of these dancers are carrying the trident or the trishul, and also the Velayuda, which is the godly weapon of God Skanda.
To the energetic accompaniment of the drum tawil from the temples of South India, snare drum and side drums. The instrument the dancers carry on their shoulders, known as kavadi, symbolizes that the dancers hold or carry the 2 feet of God Kataragama on their shoulders. The 2 sides of the instruments, decorated with peacock feathers, symbolize the 2 feet of God Kataragama. And today you can see the traditional instruments have been replaced with modern Western instruments like the trumpet, whereas the traditional usage was the blowing of the nadaswaram and playing the tawil drum.
Following this energetic dance performance, now we see another elephant who is Panduka, belonging to the Ganevatta Kataragama Devalaya, and this elephant is currently under the responsibility of the former minister Chandana Katriarachchi.
And following that, we see the West dancing troupe paying respect to the godly ornaments of God Skanda.
And this troupe of West dancers are trained by Mr. Upananda Thalgahagoda of the Ratna Kala Ayam.
Another significant difference between the Kumbal Perahera and the Randoli Procession is that during the Kumbal Perahera, we saw the godly ornaments were accompanied by Nayandi dancers. But in the Randoli procession, we see the West dancers accompanying all the godly ornaments.
And we can see and hear that it's not just the West dancers, but we also see the touch of South Indian form of music as well. So I think Mr. Ravibanda Vidyapathy would explain once we enjoy this dancing performance.
Well, the tawil drum is accompanying the West dancers here, possibly as a combination or a mark of respect for God Kataragama, as in the Hindu traditions, in the Hindu temples, tawil is considered the Mangala Vadya or the auspicious drum, as we call the Gataberaya, also Magul Beraya, as a Mangala Vadya and auspicious drum. So the combination of 2 auspicious drums together paying homage to God Kataragama.
Indeed. And this depicts that this is one of the most majestic and elegant cultural fusion that we can see in our country.
Indeed, and here we can see the Nadaswaram players playing kirtanams to the accompaniment of the tawils.
And interestingly, they play a song which is a tribute to Lord Buddha, isn't it?
Following that, we see the heir or the chief trustee of God of the Kataragama Devalaya.
And this ceremonial effect
And now
today
we
is
see
Aruna, belonging to the Handala Rajamahaviharaya, who is accompanied by Asala of the Pirisyala Senanayaka Mudalindaramaya and Sankaraja of the Sankapala Rajamahaviharaya in Amilipitiya. And now we see the West dancing troupe, in fact the second West dancing troupe of the Sri Maha Kataragama Devala procession, who will be escorting the Basnayaka Nilame of the Sri Maha Kataragama Devala, or in fact a representation of the Sri Maha Kataragama Devala. Raiband, we previously spoke about the Naru Matra, so if you could explain about what is the word Naru.
Hanging from the two sides, the back with top with a flower-like form. And in the Kandian dancer, it is said that he uses 9 such pleated pieces known as Nava Naru.
And today, representing the Sri Maha Kataragama Devalaya, we see on one side the Basnayaka Nilame of the Sri Maha Kataragama Devalaya himself, Valisundara Yamunu Tilaka Bandara Valisundara, and accompanying him we have the Basnayaka Nilame of the Matale Amboka Pattini Devalaya, Basnayaka Nilame Ryan Valisundara, who is in fact Basnayaka Nilame's elder son himself. That itself proves that such traditions are passed on from families.
Indeed, Nilesh.
And I think it's the first Esala Perahera which Brian Valisundara Nilame is joining as the newly appointed Basnayak Nilame of the Amboka Pattini Devalaya in Matale.
And once again, this is a fine indication for the fact that our ancient traditions are being passed down to the future generations, and they will be preserved for yet another thousands of years.
That would be the pledge of everyone who would appreciate and respect the traditional Sri Lankan customs. That marks the end of the procession of the Sri Maha Kataragama Devalaya, and now we begin the last Devala procession for the day, which is of the Sri Maha Pattini Devalaya in Kandy.
We now see the officials and the Alati Ammas performing the rituals before the commencement of the Pattini Devala procession. The godly ornaments of Goddess Pattini are now being carried by the officials to be placed on the mount of the elephant, who will be taking them in the streets of Kandy today.
And leading the procession of Goddess Pattini, we can see the Buddhist flag bearers.
This is a troop trained by the Civil Defense Department.
Has to be mentioned, the Civil Defense Unit of Pallikele has been playing a major role in the Kandy Esala Perahera this year.
The Alati Ammas is the Sri Lankan form of the Devadasi tradition found in the Hindu temples of South India. And this tradition is carried forth in the other Devalas as well.
And it is remarkable that in the Pattini Devala procession, we see a plenty of female representation, which is a very special occasion.
Well, I think the Pattini Devala Perahera is the only Perahera that allows female performers in the Kandy Esala Perahera.
Indeed, sir. And now we see the heresy troupe of the Pattini Devalaya. This troupe of heavy sea dancers have been trained by Mr. Palitha Nishankar, Mr. M.G. Sirisena and Mr. M.G. Premadasa. Goddess Pattini is revered by many Buddhists and Hindu pilgrims alike. This is due to the fact that she is considered as a goddess of fertility and prosperity.
She is also worshipped as the goddess of chastity in both Hinduism and in Sri Lanka as well.
And now we see the Gajanayaka Nilame of the Sri Mahapattini Devalaya in Kandy, who is the official responsible for the troop of elephants taking part. And this elephant is Bandara, who belongs to Mr. Kitsiri Kahatapitiya of Horana. We saw Bandara as an accompanying elephant for the ceremonial tasker during the Kumbal Perahera processions, and today he is leading the procession with the Gajanayaka Nilame.
And following that, we see one of the most spectacular and special events. This is the female Pantheru dancers team, trained by Miss Vindhya Kulasiri from Jayashani Udaratanarthana Kalayatanaya in Gorakadaniya.
The tradition of female Kandian dancers or Pantheru dancers came into being in the 1940s onwards. The traditional Kandian dance form thrived amongst men alone in the past. As the modernism movement came into being in Sri Lanka in the early 1940s, many female dancers took to learning the traditional dance forms.
And the elephant who just passed was Sita, who belongs to Mr. Roshan Patirana of Maharagama.
Following that, we see another very colorful and very energetic performance. This is a mixed folk dance representing the functions of the agrarian society which prevailed in Sri Lanka in the times of our ancient kings and which still prevails. As we can see, this dance is a collaborative dance of both men and women.
Both men and women, and also the dancers using different equipments, tools used in the agrarian activities of the country. The sickle, the winnowing fan, the pot, and also symbolizing the fertility and prosperity, they carry bunches of paddy.
And this troupe has been trained by Miss Takshila Sirivardhana from the Takshila Kalayatanaya in Yatihalagala.
And following this dance act, we see two more elephants joining in. On one side, we see Tarindu belonging to Venerable Kobawaka Damminda Thero, the chief incumbent of the Kirivehera Rajamaha Vihara in Kataragama. And on the other side, we see Raja belonging to Mr. Asanka Vijay of Balangoda. In fact, Raja and Tarindu are two elephants who share a very loving bond with each other as a grandfather and grandson, unrelated.
And following that, we see another spectacular dance of Paturu dance. This performance has been trained by Mr. Nishanta Sanjeeva from Navarangla Kalayatanaya.
Paturu dance is also another popular folk dance in the Sinhala dance culture. This instrument patura is made out of wood by carving a plank of wood into several strips, and the striking of the instrument onto the dancer's body and the palms make sounds that energize the dancers along with the sound of the drum.
This is the sound of our ancient history. This is the sound of our legends. This is the sound of our beloved history.
And following the Paturu dance, the elephant who we just saw was Kumari, who belongs to Mr. Asanka Vijayasinghe of Balangoda. And on the mount of Kumari, we see two officials carrying canopies, which is to symbolize protection to the upcoming godly ornaments of goddess Patini.
And following that, we see a Chamara dancing troupe which consists of women. And this female Chamara dancing troupe is trained by Miss Ajanta Kande Gedera from the Sarasavi Kalayatanaya in Molagoda. The gentle breeze produced by these fans are not only cooling the streets of Kandy, but also the hearts of the spectators.
Just as we pass the female dancers, we see another regular female participant of the Sri Mahapatini Devala procession, and she is Manika, who belongs to Mrs. Shriyani Gunawardana of Dangovita. In fact, Manika was one of the few fortunate elephants who were lucky to act as accompanying elephants to the ceremonial tusker back then in the year 2019.
Following that, we see the West dancing troupe representing the Sri Mahapatini Devala procession. It should be noted that the color affiliated with goddess Patini is yellow. Due to this reason, most of the garments of the elephants and most of the clothes worn by the performers would also be yellow in most of the occasions.
Isuru, now that we've been talking about the dancers, I'd like to add a word about the drummers in the Perahera. In this case, the Kandian drum. All the rhythm patterns played on Gatabera accompanying the West dance are based on four basic sounds known as Tat, Jit, Ton, Nam. And the drums are always played as two groups, one group keeping the basic rhythm and the other group making variations to give the dancers the proper stimulation and inspiration to execute the movements.
Indeed, sir. This is the West dancing troupe trained by Mr. Mithun Bandara from the Mithun Bandara Kalayatanaya in Watapulua.
And now, escorted by these West dancers, we see the chief incumbent of the Sri Mahapattini Devalaya, who is walking ahead of the ceremonial elephant who will be carrying the godly ornaments of Goddess Pattini. And for the 13th year, we see the great elephant Mangala, belonging to the Venerable Mahanayaka Thero of the Sri Lanka Ramana Nikaya, carrying the godly ornaments of Goddess Pattini. And Mangala is currently under the responsibility of Mr. Udara Galapatti of Giriyulla. And accompanying Mangala, we see Rani belonging to Mr. Richard Gonakumbura of Balangoda and Manike belonging to Mr. H.R. Nishankar of Kegol.
We now see the delightful sight of the godly ornaments of Goddess Pattini. People sought protection and the care of Goddess Pattini in the face of plagues and famines in the past. And this is why people are still asking for the protection of Goddess Pattini when they have illnesses and when the plagues are spreading in the country.
And now we see the second and last troupe of West dancers of the Sri Mahapattini Devalaya who will be escorting the Basnayaka Nilame.
And this West dancing troupe has been trained by Mr. Chandana K. Jayaratna from the Chandana Kalayatanaya in Matale.
Apart from the Kavadi dancers represented in the Kataragama Esala Perahera, all the other dances in the Kandy Esala Perahera belong to the Kandian tradition. And this is one of the main features of this Perahera, and one of the uniqueness of the Perahera is that it is confined to dance forms pertaining to the Kandian tradition.
And today, representing the Sri Mahapattini Devalaya, we see the Basnayak Nilame of the Ambakke Kataragama Devalaya, Shanaka Bandaranayaka, who will be representing the Basnayak Nilame of the Sri Mahapattini Devalaya in the third Randoli Procession for 2021. In fact, it is the usual custom that we only see the Basnayak Nilame of the Sri Mahapattini Devalaya in the first and the last Randoli processions, whereas the Basnayak Nilames of the rural shrines attached to the Sri Mahapattini Devalaya and the main shrines will be joining the procession in the third, second and fourth Randoli processions.
We now see the Randolis being carried along, the golden palanquins, the golden palanquins, now symbolically representing the carriages of the ancient queens who travelled in the Perahera in these palanquins. The Dolava.
Indeed, this is a very beautiful sight, adorned with a lot of decorations and colors. The Dolavas pass, marking the end of the third Randoli procession. What you just saw was the conclusion of the third Randoli Procession. We are grateful for the support and commitment of both state and non-state supporters who work tirelessly to make this event successful.
Let there be timely rains that will bring life-giving water to our fields and ensure a bountiful harvest.
May our country prosper. Dalanda Samidu Pihitai.